distant quality to it because we're watching on television. We're so accustomed to violence on television. So accustomed. I mean, when the plane flew into one of the two towers which we saw before our eyes, you thought, well, you know, it's like the graphic artist, isn't it? So what we haven't had here yet is an appreciation of the suffering that's occurring on the streets and in those buildings.
Well, what the widening scope of the injuries, they have now notified hospitals in the outlying boroughs outside Manhattan, and they have cleared routes through the streets, covering miles for caravans of ambulances to bring the injured out as they do the triage. The lower Manhattan and central Manhattan hospitals like Bellevue quickly filled up very early on. They have now set up a system of helicopters, which they have to be very careful with because of the ban on air traffic, that everybody knows who everybody is who's flying, and that there's communications between all of them to shuttle people out. The military has offered military aircraft for that kind of transport, and military surgeons have been brought to the scene. One thing unfolding right now is they've asked for gas to be shut off in that area for blocks and blocks, because after the two collapses, gas mains were opened up and there's a gas leak in the air which only fosters the danger of yet more explosions.
Exactly. Pierre?
Well, one of the things that they've been very concerned about in recent years is the notion that could hospitals deal with massive amounts of casualties like this. And now they're going to...
Let me just interrupt you for a second so we hear it as it's happening.
Just come out, we're walking.
It's just come down. The second everyone's being asked to get down, come down. The people are now panicking again.
Give him here. You can walk. You can fill it. Okay. Make a hole, man. Make a fucking hole. Make a fucking hole. Make a fucking hole. Fuck off.
Well, a scene that's been repeated hundreds and hundreds of, as far as we know, thousands of times. The reports in John Miller was talking about the number of hospitals and the military making its medical staff available to the citizen, to the layman hierarchy here. We've had reports from various hospitals saying that hundreds of people are burned from head to toe. One doctor at St. Vincent's Hospital in Lower Manhattan just simply said the place was crowding up very quickly by people who had been burned. And the horrifying magnitude of all this is to be reminded. I think I'm going to try to get this right, Nancy, but I think maybe as many as 50,000 people work in the immediate area of the Trade Center, of the World Trade Center, in which there are these two twin towers. Am I right on that as many as 50,000 people work there?
I don't know the figure, but the World Trade Center complex, not just the two towers, which are, over 100 stories each, but they're flanked by the World Financial Center. So there are clearly tens of thousands of people within a 2-block radius.
And John McWethy, who called in just a short while from the Pentagon, talking about the aircraft that had penetrated the outer ring of the Pentagon to the inner ring, we're talking about the Pentagon now, had many floors of destruction and heavy casualties. It's just impossible at the moment to grasp, other than to try to aggregate the normal circumstances of how many people live and work in the immediate area. And thousands of people work in the Pentagon every day, which has now been overrun by local police, and by state authorities and by the military itself trying to take care of its own. Tony Cordesman, who's one of our military analysts, is on the phone from Washington. Tony, what can you add to all this?
Yes. Peter, can you hear me?
Yes, Tony, I can.
I think one of the things we need to understand is we've been preparing for this kind of event for nearly a decade. We've had presidential directives. It's a project called Homeland Defense, But quite frankly, what people were most worried about was the use of weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. While we looked at this scenario, hijacked aircraft flying into buildings back in the 60s, it wasn't the focus of Homeland Defense activity. It wasn't something brought up on the screen of the Vice President's office, which formally is in charge with coordinating this effort.
But Tony, you, I know, been party to a lot of these. Is that speaker I hear behind you?
Yes,
Could you just turn around and ask somebody to turn it down?
Hold on, please. I'm on to Peter. Could you turn it down?
Thanks very much. Sorry to interrupt them because they're all
Sorry.
doing a job. But your involvement here is important because you've been involved in so much of planning and study of this operation. I don't get it. In the 1960s, yes, we looked at the possibility that people would hijack airplanes and fly into buildings. How did it get off the radar?
I think the problem, Peter, is literally we have tens of thousands of points of vulnerability. As Jack McWethy pointed earlier, it's the Pentagon. It's symbols of our national heritage, like the National Archives. It's major utilities, nuclear power plants, targets like ABC News and the networks. The problem is that anticipating all these points of them is almost impossible. There's always been this area of vulnerability, and we've always put civil liberties and civil rights before trying to deal with a comprehensive defense. This may change those priorities. It certainly is something short, if not actually at the level of an act of war.
And Tony, you have seen us this morning, or heard us this morning, go through the ritual of reciting that somebody had claimed responsibility, someone had denied responsibilities. The Palestinian Authority in the person of Yasser Arafat was very quick to come along and offer condolences to the people of the United States, to put as much distance between himself, because he gets blamed for a lot in the Middle East, certainly by the Israelis. Do you have any feel for how complicated an operation this is and who might be able to mount it, or are we just blowing in the wind at the moment?
You're not blowing in the wind at all, Peter. This is so complicated an operation that one reason we weren't ready is that no one believed there was an organization with either the intention or the capability to execute something like this. People talk about bin Laden's group, but it's an umbrella group. It is the elements under it that would have had to do it, not bin Laden himself. We have talked about Iraq, but Iraq's operations have never been particularly sophisticated. We've talked about Iran, but while we can identify that the Iranian leadership was involved in Al-Khobar, we've never seen anything this ambitious. And groups outside the Middle East, like the Japanese Red Brigades, have never come close to this level of operation. I think it's also important to note that we talked earlier about bin Laden being Arab. Bin Laden's operations now have many elements that are not Arab. They are Islamist extremists. They involve groups from countries like Pakistan and other elements. And what we've never seen is a level of coordination among all of these different groups that would lead us to prepare.
Okay, Tony, thank you very much. Very, very grateful to have you here and to remind us all that what has been happening to us all, in terms of being witnesses today to this, and everybody's now gets deeply emotional about it, the people who've been involved. Again, remind you that many thousands of people work in the Twin Trade Towers in New York City, many thousands of people that work in the Pentagon. There have been 2 aircraft at least today which have gone down with passenger loads on board, and in fact there has been a 3rd crash in Pennsylvania, which I shall bring you up to date on in just a moment. But we've had a written statement from American Airlines this morning, and let me just read it to you, or parts of it as it come. American Airlines confirms it lost 2 aircraft in what it describes as tragic incidents this morning. There was Flight 11, which was a Boeing 767 en route from Boston to Los Angeles with 81 passengers, 9 flight attendants, and 2 pilots on board. That aircraft was hijacked, to the best of our knowledge, and flown into the trade towers in New York. And Flight 77, a Boeing 757, offering from Washington Dulles to Los Angeles with 58 passengers and 4 flight attendants and 2 pilots. That aircraft is a little more uncertain. That is not a huge, it's a big aircraft, 757, but we're not certain whether that's the one that went into the Pentagon or whether it's one of the other aircraft that went into the twin trade towers. But the government has now shut down the entire air traffic system in the United States. And we learned just a while ago, for example, that all international flights heading to Canada were now going to be, for the United States, were going to be diverted to Canada. And the Canadians have now shut down their entire air traffic system as well. A reminder of how close the two nations live together and how Canadian airports from one end of the country to the other are within an hour's flight or less in some cases of major American targets. So now let's get involved with one more crash to start with. ABC's Lisa Stark, who covers aviation, is on the phone with us from Washington, or at least I believe in our bureau. Lisa, can you hear me?
Actually, Peter, I'm in Seattle today, ironically, for an aviation conference.
Okay, well
Can you
then,
hear me, Peter?
I can indeed, Lisa, and tell me what you know.
Well, what I know is that the flight that went down outside Philadelphia, I believe, in Pittsburgh, was United Airlines Flight 93. It was a Boeing 757. It was en route from Newark to San Francisco. I do not know how many people were on board that plane. United is also saying now that they are concerned about a further flight that apparently is still missing. Flight 175, it is a Boeing 767. It was scheduled from Boston to Los Angeles. That flight apparently is still unaccounted for, according to officials from United. So at least we believe there's at least one more plane that may still be flying around, in U.S. airspace. Obviously, Peter, I've also learned that one of the planes that went into the World Trade Tower was tracked by the FAA. They knew, I don't know if they knew it was hijacked or if they just knew something was wrong. Obviously, it had deviated from its flight path. They were able to track it on radar, and they did track it to lower Manhattan. That is the latest we know about the flight.
Lisa, this may seem an awfully dumb question, but given the fact that the airlines, the major airlines, operate in such an intensely coordinated way, at least with their own operation centers, how is United Flight 175, a 767 from Boston to Los Angeles, thought to be missing and unaccounted for?
Well, all United is saying is that they are, quote, concerned about that flight. What I believe is that probably that flight was hijacked as well. Where it is right now, I'm sure perhaps the FAA, the FBI, and those folks know where it is. We are not being told, but there may still be another plane flying out there that has not yet crashed or landed or whatever will happen to it. But that flight is apparently at least unaccounted for at this time as far as public release. I'm sure someone knows where that flight is.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much then. Lisa Stark in Seattle today. I thought she was in Washington, covers aviation for us. Barbara Starr, one of our principal reporters at the Pentagon, I think is on the line as well. Barbara? Barbara, do you hear me? Barbara Starr?
Yes, Peter, I'm standing outside the Pentagon. About 10 or 15 minutes ago, we saw 50 to 75 military personnel move onto the helipad. They are stretcher-bearer volunteers. They have been assembled to go in and recover any potentially dead or wounded. And we have talked to an eyewitness who was down on the helipad earlier this morning, where the fire is, of course, still ongoing. He reported seeing more than a dozen wounded personnel earlier this morning. We have seen ambulances carry people off. About an hour ago, we saw emergency medical personnel bringing out a woman and a small child in their arms. So the situation here remains quite unsettled.
Wait, can you describe a little more generally what unsettled mean? Is it calm? Is there chaos?
We have had periods of what can only be described as chaos. About 15 minutes ago, security personnel came through again and told us to start running, to move back, that there was another aircraft moving up the Potomac River from the south at a high rate of speed. Well, that apparently did not occur, and we have now moved back to our original camera position. So the police are quite at a point of quite high tension here this morning, and any little ripple is having them move people back to stay away from the building. They are extremely concerned about another attack and a potential additional explosion. They are taking every precaution.
Understandable. Barbara, the portion of the building that was breached when the aircraft crashed into it, do you know what happens in that part of the building?
Well, we're looking at it right now. Fire trucks are still pouring water more than an hour or better.
Vulnerability in a democratic society in